What kind of civilization could rise from a barren strip of North African coast, command the greatest trade network of the ancient world, and dare to challenge Rome itself? And what if I told you that this civilization's fall was so complete, so thoroughly erased, that centuries later, people debated whether it had ever truly existed? This is the story of Carthage, the city of Phoenician merchants turned maritime empire, whose ships ruled the Mediterranean, whose wealth rivaled kingdoms, and whose elephants thundered across the Alps under a general whose very name haunted Rome, Hannibal Barca. But before the fire and ashes of the Punic Wars, before the clash of steel at Cannae, Carthage was something far more extraordinary, a civilization built not on conquest, but on trade, cunning, and ambition. From its birth as a humble trading outpost to its transformation into Rome's most feared enemy, the rise of Carthage is a saga of brilliance, greed, and vengeance. Today, we'll journey through the entire history of Carthage, uncovering how a city of merchants became a legend of war. So settle in, because what begins with sails and silver will end with flames and salt. The city born from the sea long before Carthage became a name Rome would curse, the story began far to the east, among the purple-dyed merchants of Tyre. It was the 9th century BCE, a time when the Mediterranean was a canvas of opportunity. Ships from the Levant sailed west, seeking trade, land, and new markets. Among these voyagers was a woman, Queen Elissa, better known by her mythic name, Dido. According to legend, Dido fled her homeland after her brother murdered her husband for power. With courage as her compass and exile as her companion, she led her followers across the sea until they reached the coast of North Africa. There, on a narrow peninsula by the glittering waters of the Gulf of Tunis, she struck a bargain with a local Berber king. She could have as much land as could be encircled by an ox hide. What Dido did next would define Carthaginian cunning for centuries. She cut the hide into thin strips and laid them end to end, encircling an entire hill, Byrsa Hill, the heart of what would become Carthage. It was a moment that would echo through time, symbolizing the city's genius for turning limits into opportunity. But Carthage was never meant to be just another colony. Its founders carried with them the ancient knowledge of Tyre, skills in navigation, craftsmanship, and trade. They built harbors that could house hundreds of ships, warehouses brimming with silver, ivory, and amber, and markets that never slept. Every sail that crossed the sea to Carthage brought not only goods, but influence. Imagine standing atop Byrsa Hill around 800 BCE. Below you, the city's twin harbors curve like a crescent moon, one for merchants, one for warships. The scent of cedarwood and salted fish fills the air. Phoenician traders haggle over glass beads and tin ingots, their voices rising above the crash of waves. Carthage is alive, young, ambitious, and utterly self-assured, yet beneath its prosperity lies the seed of tension. Carthage owes its origins to Tyre, but distance breeds independence. As Tyre wanes under Assyrian pressure, Carthage begins to act not as a colony, but as a capital. It sends out its own settlers, founds new cities across North Africa, Sardinia, and Spain, and soon controls the western Mediterranean's most profitable trade routes. Carthage becomes a magnet for wealth and envy. Greek merchants in Sicily and Etruscan sailors in Italy watch with growing unease as the Phoenicians of the West tighten their grip on commerce. But for now, Carthage thrives, protected by its walls and guided by its god Baal-Hamon, the fiery lord of the sun. As centuries pass, Carthage transforms from a merchant's haven into a maritime empire. Its navy is unrivaled, its merchants rich beyond imagination. But empires built on trade must also defend their interests. And in the Mediterranean, that means war. By the 6th century BCE, Carthage is no longer content to trade. It dominates. Its fleets patrol the seas, its admirals enforce tariffs, and its allies depend on its power. To outsiders, the Carthaginians are secretive and calculating, a people who smile in negotiation yet crush rebellion without hesitation. To their enemies, they are the merchants of blood, who buy victory with gold and burn offerings to please their gods. Yet to their own, Carthage is the shining city of prosperity, the queen of the sea. Children grow up learning not just to farm, but to sail. Every family's fortune is tied to the harbor. Every ambition tied to the horizon. And somewhere out there, across the sea, a new power begins to rise, a city of wolves, hardened by war, unafraid of blood or conquest. Its name is Rome. But for now, Rome is just another small republic on the Italian peninsula. The two powers have yet to meet, but their destinies are already on a collision course. For when a merchant empire meets a military one, the world trembles. And Carthage, the city born from the sea, will soon learn that even the greatest traders cannot bargain with fate. The rise of the Carthaginian Empire and the shadow of Rome picture the Mediterranean in the 5th century BCE, a restless sea of ambition. Greek colonies glimmered like pearls across the Aegean and Sicily. Etruscans ruled the western coasts of Italy, and in the heart of North Africa, Carthage stood like a citadel of gold. Her merchants sailed farther than any before them. Her admirals commanded fleets that could choke entire ports into silence. And her wealth? Her wealth was the envy of every king and city-state that dreamed of dominion. Carthage's strength wasn't in conquest, at least not at first. It was in control. She didn't need to plant her flag everywhere, only to ensure that every ship passing through the Western Sea paid tribute. From the silver mines of Iberia to the fertile plains of Tunisia, every trade wind carried Carthaginian influence. Their sailors mapped coasts unknown to others. Their traders built colonies that thrived without armies. And their diplomacy, wrapped in honeyed words and contracts, bound allies more tightly than chains. But power, even subtle power, draws enemies. The Greeks of Syracuse and Sicily viewed Carthage's growing dominance as a threat to their freedom and profits. For decades, small skirmishes erupted, trading disputes, naval clashes and raids. Yet each time, Carthage responded not with fury, but with cold, calculated precision. Their generals didn't just fight battles, they fought economies. They would blockade a rival port, undercut prices, and choke off supply lines until surrender seemed like mercy. Still, the Greeks were tenacious. In the late 6th century BCE, the first true test came when the Carthaginian army landed in Sicily, led by the legendary general Mago, founder of the Majid dynasty. What began as a war for trade routes became a struggle for survival and identity. Could Carthage remain a merchant empire and still wield the sword like a conqueror? The wars were brutal. Flames devoured cities like Selinus and Himera. Thousands were enslaved. Carthaginian priests offered sacrifices to Baal Hammon and Tanit, pleading for victory. Some ancient accounts, perhaps exaggerated, perhaps not, whispered of child sacrifices, of the cries of infants rising with the smoke of burning altars. Whether myth or memory, these stories gave Carthage a sinister aura in the eyes of her enemies. To the Greeks and later the Romans, she wasn't just powerful, she was feared. And yet, Carthage adapted. Her generals became seasoned, her navy stronger, and her colonies more fortified. Over the next 2 centuries, she grew into a true empire. The Majid family ruled as both generals and statesmen, ensuring stability through a blend of military might and commercial genius. The city's twin harbors, one circular, one rectangular, became marvels of engineering, capable of launching hundreds of warships in hours. But Carthage's expansion had limits. The western Mediterranean was her domain, yet across the Tyrrhenian Sea, another power was rising, quietly, methodically, with a hunger that no treaty could tame. Rome. At first, the two cities coexisted. They traded, respected each other's zones, and even formed alliances when convenient. In fact, the earliest treaties between Rome and Carthage, carved into bronze tablets, spoke of friendship and mutual respect. Carthage would not interfere with Roman affairs in Italy. Rome would not intrude upon Carthage's dominion in Africa and the western seas. It was a delicate peace, one born of calculation rather than trust. Both sides understood that peace was only temporary, a pause between inevitable storms. Meanwhile, Carthage's power reached new heights. In Spain, her traders tapped into the glittering veins of silver and copper. In Sardinia and Corsica, she controlled the grain and tin trade. North Africa's fertile plains made her the breadbasket of the sea. Her city shimmered with marble temples and bustling markets. The Senate, a council of the wealthy elite, governed with a mix of republican order and oligarchic privilege. While Greece experimented with democracy and Rome balanced republic and ambition, Carthage thrived under the rule of merchants who measured value in ships, not soldiers, and yet, beneath the prosperity, something dark was brewing. The wars in Sicily had drained resources and pride. Many among the Carthaginian elite began to resent the military. Men who had risen from obscurity through victory, gaining influence that threatened the merchant class. Among these was a name that would echo through history: Hamilcar Barca. Hamilcar was not just a general. He was a force of nature. He saw Carthage's dependence on trade as both its strength and its weakness. Gold buys peace, he is said to have told the Senate. But only the sword keeps it. He would prove that prophecy true. When Carthage lost the First Punic War to Rome, a war that raged for over 20 years across Sicily and the seas, the humiliation was unbearable. Carthage's navy, once supreme, had been broken. Her treasury emptied, her pride wounded beyond words. And to make matters worse, mercenaries who had fought for Carthage revolted when their pay was delayed. The result was one of the most gruesome civil wars in ancient history, the Mercenary War, also known as the War Without Truce. Hamilcar led the fight against these rebels, showing a level of cruelty and resolve that terrified even his allies. When the last of the mercenaries were captured, Hamilcar had them crucified in rows, stretching for miles. It was his message to the world. Carthage would not fall to its own weakness, but Hamilcar's ambitions stretched beyond vengeance. He knew Rome would never allow Carthage to rise again unless Carthage changed its destiny. So he looked west, to Spain, rich in mines, manpower, and opportunity. There, he began to rebuild. In Spain, Hamilcar's army became a new breed, part merchant, part soldier, loyal not to the Senate, but to him and his family. He trained his sons to carry his mission forward. The eldest, Hannibal, watched and learned, absorbing his father's lessons of discipline, strategy, and hatred. Before one campaign, as legend tells, Hamilcar took his young son to the altar of Baal Hammon. There, before the blazing fire, he made Hannibal swear an oath, never to be a friend to Rome. That oath would ignite the most famous war of antiquity, and turn Hannibal into a name whispered with both awe and dread. Carthage had rebuilt its power not through peace, but through vengeance. Rome had grown into an empire of soldiers, disciplined and relentless. Two powers, one born from the sea, the other forged by the sword, now stood ready for their reckoning. And as the sun set over the silver hills of Iberia, the shadow of Rome stretched long over Carthage's destiny. The world had seen wars before, but none like what was coming next. Hannibal, the oath, the march, and the wrath of Rome. Have you ever wondered what it takes to challenge an empire that calls itself eternal? To face an enemy whose soldiers never retreat, whose discipline is as cold as iron, and whose pride cannot bear the taste of defeat? That was the challenge a young Carthaginian general named Hannibal Barca accepted, not for glory, not for gold, but because of a promise he made as a child. With blood and fire as his witnesses, the year was around 237 BCE. Carthage was licking its wounds after the First Punic War, a brutal 20-year struggle that had stripped it of Sicily and humiliated its once mighty navy. In the aftermath, Hamilcar Barca, the brilliant general who refused to bow to despair, turned his gaze toward Iberia, modern Spain. There, amid mountains rich with silver and tribes eager for war, he began to rebuild Carthage's fortunes. He brought with him his son Hannibal, barely 9 years old. Legend says Hamilcar led the boy to a temple, placed his small hand on the flaming altar of Baal Hammon, and made him swear a sacred vow that he would never be a friend to Rome. The boy's eyes burned with conviction as he repeated the oath. That moment shaped history. For Hannibal Barca, hatred of Rome wasn't politics, it was destiny. Years passed. Hamilcar's campaigns expanded Carthaginian control across Spain, enriching the empire and creating a new source of power beyond the Senate's reach. When Hamilcar fell in battle, his son-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair, continued his work, founding the great city of Carthago Nova, modern Cartagena, a jewel of Carthaginian influence in Iberia. But when Hasdrubal was assassinated in 221 BCE, the soldiers cried out for Hannibal to take command. He was just 25. From the moment he assumed control, Hannibal proved different from any commander Carthage had ever known. He didn't lead from behind, surrounded by luxury. He slept where his men slept, ate what they ate, fought where they fought. To his soldiers, he was not only their general, he was one of them. To his enemies, he became a ghost, unpredictable, audacious, and relentless. Rome, ever watchful, saw the danger. The treaty between the two powers had drawn the Ebro River as the line of division. Carthage would not expand north of it. But Hannibal's ambitions didn't stop at rivers. When he laid siege to Saguntum, a city allied with Rome but south of that line, it was not just an attack. It was a declaration. Rome demanded his surrender. Carthage's Senate hesitated, torn between pride and fear. Hannibal gave them neither choice nor time. By 219 BCE, Saguntum was in ashes, and Rome's messengers carried one message back: the war has begun. What followed would become one of the most audacious military campaigns in all of human history. Hannibal, with an army of roughly 90,000 men, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants, made a decision no sane general would dare. He would march on Rome, but not by sea. Not by the easy roads of Italy. He would cross the Alps. Imagine it. Tens of thousands of soldiers trudging through snow and rock, freezing winds tearing at their faces, cliffs crumbling beneath their feet, elephants slipping on icy slopes. The journey was a nightmare. In those mountains, death claimed more soldiers than battle ever could. Ambushed by mountain tribes, battered by blizzards, and haunted by hunger, Hannibal's army seemed doomed. But he pressed on. He spoke to his men at night by the campfires, reminding them what they fought for: revenge, glory, and the promise of seeing Rome burn. He pointed toward the horizon where the Italian plains awaited beyond the peaks. "You will find there," he said, "not walls and weapons, but the harvest of your courage." When Hannibal finally descended into Italy, only half his army remained. But what an army it was! Hardened by suffering, welded together by faith in their leader. Rome expected him to strike and retreat, as other invaders had done. Instead, Hannibal unleashed a series of victories that would shatter Roman confidence. At Trebia, in the icy winter of 218 BCE, he lured the Roman legions across a frozen river and ambushed them from behind with hidden cavalry. Thousands died in the freezing waters, their red cloaks turning the river crimson. At Lake Trasimene, he trapped another Roman army in a fog-shrouded valley, attacking from all sides in a surprise so complete that entire legions vanished beneath the mist. It was one of the largest ambushes in military history. Rome trembled, but Hannibal wasn't finished. In 216 BCE, he faced the might of Rome at Cannae, a battle that would become a masterpiece of tactics, studied by generals for millennia. Outnumbered nearly 2-1, Hannibal drew the Romans into a trap so precise it seemed almost like magic. His center line bent backward under Roman pressure, while his cavalry swept behind, closing the circle. By day's end, over 50,000 Roman soldiers lay dead, an entire army annihilated. Senators wept in the streets of Rome. Mothers tore their hair in grief. Never before had the Republic suffered such a catastrophe, and yet Hannibal did not march on Rome. Why? Historians still debate. His army was exhausted, his supply lines stretched thin, and Carthage, complacent, political, fearful, sent little reinforcements. Hannibal's greatest victory became the turning point he could not exploit. Rome, wounded but not dead, began to adapt. The Republic changed its strategy. No more direct battles. Instead, it adopted Fabian tactics, named after General Fabius Maximus: delay, harass, avoid confrontation. Rome used time as its weapon, bleeding Hannibal slowly. Meanwhile, Carthage's Senate, jealous of Hannibal's fame, hesitated to send aid. It was as if Carthage itself had betrayed its own savior. For years, Hannibal roamed Italy, undefeated yet unable to strike the final blow. He tried to break Rome's alliances, to turn her Italian subjects against her, but the Romans clung to unity, driven by fear and pride. The tides began to turn. Rome's young generals like Publius Cornelius Scipio learned from defeat. They studied Hannibal's tactics, mirrored his brilliance, and prepared to strike back, not in Italy, but in Spain, and eventually in Africa itself. As the years dragged on, Hannibal's dream of Rome's destruction faded into endurance. He watched comrades die, supplies dwindle, and hope slip away like sand between his fingers. Still, he refused to surrender. He had sworn before the gods to be Rome's enemy, and he would keep that vow until death. When word finally reached him that Rome's armies, under Scipio, had landed in North Africa, Hannibal returned home for one last stand. The battle that awaited, Zama, would decide not just his fate, but Carthage's soul. In that moment, standing on African soil with the Roman legions approaching, Hannibal must have remembered his oath as a boy, the promise made in fire. He had brought Rome to the edge of ruin, made her bleed and tremble. But now the hunter had become the hunted, and as the dust of Zama rose on the horizon, history held its breath. The fall of Carthage, Zama, defeat, and desperation. There is a moment in every great civilization when the winds of fate shift, when the empire that once commanded the seas finds its sails torn, its pride bleeding, its gods silent. For Carthage, that moment came on the plains of Zama. The year was 202 BCE, and the world watched as two titans prepared to collide for the final time. On one side stood Hannibal Barca, the man who had haunted Rome for nearly 2 decades, his very name whispered like a curse. On the other stood Publius Cornelius Scipio, called Scipio Africanus, the Roman who had studied Hannibal's every move, learned his every trick, and come to end the nightmare once and for all. Zama lay just a few days' march from Carthage itself. The African sun burned red over the desert plain. The dust carried the scent of destiny. Hannibal had returned home at last, not as the conquering hero he once dreamed of, but as the last shield between Carthage and extinction. He had seen empires rise and crumble, kings kneel and betray. He had crossed the Alps, slaughtered legions, and outwitted Rome at every turn. But now, for the first time, he faced a man who understood him, who had learned from him. As the two generals met before the battle, a hush fell across the land. They spoke not as enemies, but as equals bound by fate. Hannibal, weary but proud, warned Scipio of the price of victory. "It is easy to begin a war," he said, "but not so easy to end one." Scipio listened, silent and unflinching. Two men parted with respect, and the knowledge that only one of them would live to see his homeland free. When dawn broke, the field of Zama erupted into chaos. Hannibal unleashed his war elephants, the beasts that had once terrified Roman soldiers in the Alps. But Scipio's legions had learned. Trumpets blared, the ranks opened, and the elephants charged harmlessly through corridors of disciplined soldiers, frightened and confused. Then came the cavalry, led by Massinissa, the Numidian king, who had once been Carthage's ally but now fought for Rome. His horsemen struck from the flanks like lightning. Hannibal's veterans, the remnants of his great army, men who had fought with him from Spain to Italy, stood their ground. They fought with the desperation of ghosts, blades flashing in the sun. But discipline, tactics, and the relentless organization of Rome prevailed. By day's end, tens of thousands lay dead. Hannibal's army was broken. The dream of Carthage's vengeance died in the dust. As the survivors fled, Hannibal stood among the wreckage, silent. He had given everything, his youth, his victories, his very soul, to fulfill an oath sworn long ago. Now, as he looked toward Carthage, he saw not a proud empire, but a trembling city awaiting Rome's judgment. When the news reached the Senate, Carthage erupted in mourning. Families filled the streets, tearing their clothes, calling upon Baal and Tanit for mercy. But there was none to be found. Rome's terms were merciless. Carthage would surrender its fleet, pay an immense tribute of silver, and vow never again to wage war without Rome's permission. The city that once commanded the Mediterranean now crawled under Rome's heel. Hannibal, though defeated, remained defiant. Rome expected him to disappear into obscurity. But the Lion of Carthage had other plans. He turned his sharp mind to politics, becoming suffet, the highest magistrate in the Carthaginian government. His reforms terrified the wealthy elite. He fought corruption, exposed hidden greed, and restored prosperity through sheer will. But his success made him dangerous, and his enemies whispered his name into Roman ears. Soon, the Senate in Rome demanded his surrender again. To avoid capture, Hannibal fled into exile, wandering from court to court, a relic of a lost age. He offered his military genius to kings and empires, always hunted by Rome's reach. In Bithynia, far from home, old and weary, Hannibal received word that Roman envoys had come once more to demand his capture. He smiled bitterly. "Let us free Rome from her long anxiety," he said, and drank a vial of poison he had long carried for this moment. As death closed in, he whispered, "What a relief it will be to the Romans, who have grown weary of waiting for an old man's death." Thus ended the life of one of history's greatest minds. Not on the battlefield, but in exile, hunted by the fear he had sown. But though Hannibal was gone, Rome's hatred of Carthage was not. To Rome, the city still represented defiance, a symbol that had to be erased. For 50 years after Zama, Carthage lived in uneasy peace. It rebuilt slowly, its merchants returning to trade, its harbors busy once more. It paid every tribute on time, obeyed every Roman demand. Yet, as the city's wealth grew again, Rome's paranoia returned. The Senator Cato the Elder ended every speech, no matter the topic, with the same chilling words: "Carthago delenda est." Carthage must be destroyed, and destroy it they would. In 149 BCE, Rome declared war once more, the Third Punic War. But this time, it wasn't about defense or revenge. It was annihilation. The Roman legions landed in Africa, surrounding Carthage like wolves. The Senate had demanded the unthinkable, that the city's inhabitants abandon their home and move inland, leaving their beloved city to be demolished. The Carthaginians refused. If Rome wanted Carthage, it would have to take it by blood. Men, women, and even children took up arms. For 3 years, Carthage resisted the siege, fighting street by street, room by room. The air was thick with smoke and screams, the harbor filled with burning ships. Famine ravaged the defenders. At last, in 146 BCE, the Roman general Scipio Aemilianus, grandson of Scipio Africanus, breached the walls. What followed was slaughter. The city burned for days. Statues melted in the heat, temples crumbled, and the cries of the dying echoed across the sea. As Scipio watched Carthage burn, he wept. His friend Polybius recorded that he recited a line from Homer: "A day will come when sacred Troy shall perish, and Priam and his people shall be slain." He knew what Rome had done, and he knew what Rome would one day suffer. When the fires died, Rome sowed the earth with salt, or, so legend says, so that nothing would ever grow there again. Carthage, the city born from the sea, was no more. Yet even in ashes, Carthage refused to vanish. Its story endured, of traders who became warriors, of a boy who swore eternal vengeance, of a people who defied the greatest power the world had ever seen. Carthage fell, yes, but it did not vanish. Its spirit lived on, in legend, in memory, and in every heart that dares to stand against impossible odds. Legacy of Carthage. The echo that defied time. Centuries have passed since the last flames of Carthage turned the African night sky red. The ashes of that once great city have long mingled with the soil. The cries of its people faded into history. Yet Carthage never truly died. Its memory endures, not as rubble buried beneath Roman triumphs, but as an eternal echo of brilliance, tragedy, and defiance. After the final siege in 146 BCE, Rome built a new city upon the ruins, first as a colony, later as a provincial capital. The irony was almost poetic. The conqueror who had sworn to erase Carthage now found itself rebuilding it, unable to resist the magnetic power of the land it had destroyed. The harbor that once launched fleets of trade and war was dredged again. Villas and forums rose where temples once stood. Within a few generations, Roman Carthage had become one of the jewels of Africa, a city reborn under the empire that had once vowed to wipe it from the earth. But the old spirit lingered in the stones, whispering through the winds that swept across Byrsa Hill. Travelers spoke of strange ruins and stories that the Romans could not silence. Tales of Hannibal, the genius who had brought Rome to its knees, of Dido, who carved her city from an ox hide, of merchants who had ruled the waves by wit rather than by sword. Even Roman historians, though sworn to glorify their republic, could not help but admire the cunning, courage, and endurance of their former enemy. Polybius called Hannibal the greatest strategist who ever lived. Livy, Rome's own chronicler, admitted that no other commander had possessed such audacity and intellect. Even the Roman general Scipio Africanus, who had defeated him, revered him, saying that had fate reversed their places, Hannibal would have triumphed. For Carthage was not merely a city. It was an idea, the belief that intelligence could rival brute strength, that trade and diplomacy could build empires as mighty as those forged by conquest. The Carthaginians were sailors, scientists, astronomers, and entrepreneurs. They mapped winds, studied tides, and established commercial routes that connected distant worlds centuries before the rise of modern empires. Their mastery of navigation allowed them to reach the edges of the known world. Some ancient writers claimed that Carthaginian sailors even ventured beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, to explore the mysterious coasts of the Atlantic. Whether myth or truth, it showed the boldness of a people who saw the sea not as a barrier, but as an open road. Carthage also left behind lessons in governance and economics. Its Senate, made up of wealthy merchants and aristocrats, was among the earliest models of a republican system, one that Rome itself studied and, in some ways, imitated. Aristotle once wrote that Carthage had one of the best-run governments of the ancient world, stable, flexible, and pragmatic. Its people knew how to balance commerce with military power, how to manage alliances, and how to turn even defeat into opportunity. Yet, for all their brilliance, the Carthaginians carried one fatal flaw: they underestimated envy. Their prosperity, secrecy, and pride provoked suspicion in those who could not rival their success. And when fear and jealousy take root in the hearts of nations, destruction often follows. Still, time has a strange way of healing even the deepest wounds. Long after Carthage's fall, its spirit found new forms. Under Roman rule, the city rose again as a center of art, learning, and faith. In later centuries, it became one of the pillars of early Christianity, home to thinkers like Tertullian and St. Augustine, whose words would shape Western philosophy for millennia. The city that had once bowed before Baal and Tanit became a beacon of a new spiritual empire. Archaeologists today still uncover pieces of that layered past: Phoenician altars buried beneath Roman mosaics, coins stamped with the proud horse of Carthage, amphorae that once carried olive oil across the sea. Each fragment tells a story not of defeat, but of endurance. Stand on Byrsa Hill today, and you can still feel it, the hum of history beneath your feet. To the west lies the blue shimmer of the Mediterranean, calm and deceptively gentle. To the east, the ruins of ancient walls crumble beneath the sun. Somewhere below that soil rest the ashes of those who fought and died to protect their city from the wrath of Rome. And if you listen closely, you might imagine the echo of distant voices, the clash of swords, the crackle of flames, the roar of elephants crossing the mountains. Carthage reminds us that civilizations, no matter how mighty, are fragile, that power can vanish in a heartbeat, but legacy endures through memory. The Romans may have sown salt into her soil, but they could not salt away her story. In the end, Carthage's greatest victory was not in war, but in remembrance. Her enemies wrote her downfall, yet in doing so, they immortalized her. Every time we speak the name Carthage, we resurrect a world that refused to be forgotten. So, as you close your eyes and picture the crimson sails on the horizon, the thunder of hooves on the alpine trails, the burning city beneath a blood-red sky, remember that what was once destroyed in fire still lives in flame, the flame of ambition, The flame of defiance. The flame of Carthage,